Folks, I realize that it's unscriptural to start before 7 minutes after the time we are supposed to, but I've got a lot of things I want to share with you today, so let's go ahead and get started this morning. I appreciate so much Carlin inviting me to fill the classroom role during the month of August, and I have what I consider a very exciting topic for us to discuss, and one that's very near and dear to my heart. And a lot of people would think that I have something wrong mentally when I choose this topic. It's from the book of Revelation. Now, let me ask you, just for my own personal information, how many Revelation scholars do we have in our midst? We have one retired preacher over here, so I felt like he probably is. I don't see any other hands. Oh, that's surprising. Oh, that just shocks me. You know, Revelation is such a fascinating book, such a fascinating study, and I taught it I don't know how many times, and I studied under an individual that I feel like was a true scholar, a great man of God, and I know you know Dr. Ian Fair. Great study of the book of Revelation. Took a whole semester looking at that study, and it was something that opened my eyes to something I'd never seen before. A lot of people, as we all are probably aware, are a little bit hesitant to get into the book of Revelation. They're a little intimidated. Why? Why are people hesitant or reluctant or even, I think maybe frightened might be a little bit over the top? Why are people so intimidated by the book of Revelation? The imagery, very good. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. There are a lot of things that in our society we just don't understand. And yet, folks, let me tell you, you get into the book of Revelation, it's a story of victory. It's a story of glory. It's a story of beauty and wonder and excitement. And it's such a shame that the book is so neglected by a lot of Christians. I just love studying in Revelation. I just love teaching Revelation. What we're going to do, like I say, Carlin asked me to fill the classroom role for the month of August, which is good because after 44 years of preaching, I hadn't been the full-time preacher anywhere since April. And I'm having withdrawals, to be honest with you. I start shaking a little. You'll know what's going on. I'm fine. But I am thrilled to be here. We're going to look at only just a very, very small slice of Revelation. And it's a portion of Revelation that probably most people are far more familiar with than any other part. Revelation, the 2nd and 3rd chapters. Now, I know a lot of you are familiar with those two chapters in Revelation. What is the context in those two chapters? Very good. There's going to be a discussion with the 7 churches of Asia. Asia Minor, to be more precise. Who's going to deliver this message? Pardon me? John is going to write it, and Jesus is going to deliver it. Very, very good. That's exactly right. Jesus is speaking to these 7 real, honest-to-goodness, individual churches. And we're going to talk more about that. In fact, let's talk about it right now. Were those the only 7 churches that we know of in what we call the New Testament world? No. What about Colossae? What about Troas? What about Rome? Wonder why Jesus chose to speak only to 7 churches in Asia. I know somebody knows the answer to that question. You know, all those years I was a high school teacher, high school coach, high school principal, and all the years I preached, sometimes if people didn't answer, you know what I'd do? I'd have everybody stand up and do jumping jacks. Now, y'all don't want to do that, I know. Why did Jesus pick 7 churches instead of the host of other congregations from the New Testament about which we know? Why only 7? Yes, sir.
7 represents a complete number by most of the time. Okay. And when he did it to the 7 churches, that pretty well covered everything everybody else was doing anyhow. It covered all the subjects that he wanted to cover. So he's got a complete number, and he's covered the subjects and the sins and the good things and the bad things that the other churches are involved in too.
Very good. Very good point. Number 7, as correctly pointed out, tell me your name one more time. I'm sorry. Ron. There's my name expert right back there. So I may just set her right here next to me to tell me who's talking. And y'all got an advantage. You've only got one name to remember. I've got a whole bunch of folks. And at my age, that's not a good sign. That's not good. But as Ron pointed out, the number 7, oftentimes we're going to say, and we'll point this out several times as we go through these messages that Jesus has for the 7 churches. 7 represented complete, wholeness, the totality. You know, we do this kind of thing all the time, don't we? We don't think about it. How many buildings that we know of have a 13th floor? There's no 13th floor. Why? We think it's bad luck. Nobody wants to live or work on the 13th floor, so we just skip it. But particularly with the Jewish folks, they practice, and not just the Jews, but in antiquity, numerology, where numbers meant something special. And we see that throughout the book of Revelation. In fact, Revelation, you've got to understand this, and we're going to spend more time today talking about what we might call the nature and the style of Revelation before we get into the 7 churches. Originally, I thought we'd talk about this and then we'd start with the first of the 7 churches, Ephesus, today, but I don't think we'll have time. I think that we will deal with some revelation, some background, because if you don't understand these things about Revelation, there's a lot of revelation you're not going to understand. A lot of it won't make sense. A lot of it won't have the impact that it can. But the number 7 represents, and these 7 churches, if you can imagine in your mind, I'm not a technology person, Adrian, like you, so I don't have a map up there to show them. But if you think about on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea, you've got the Grecian Peninsula here, you've got the Aegean Sea here, and then right over here on the eastern side is where these 7 churches were. Real, honest to goodness, individual churches. And they were all on what's called a Roman postal road. And kind of visualize a horseshoe shape. You got 3 on this side, adjacent to the Aegean Sea, and then you got 4 on this side of the horseshoe. Now the Romans, and by the way, I'm having a hard time standing behind the pulpit. That's not my nature. And so I know we're live streaming, and so if I walk away from the microphone, do this. I don't know what you're saying. These 7 churches, like I say, on this horseshoe, on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea, the Romans were great at road construction. In fact, do you realize that some of the roads constructed during the Roman Empire are still used today? Fascinating. And these 7 churches were all on one of these Roman postal roads, as they call it. These roads made it very, very easy to do what in the Roman Empire? I'm sorry? Trade. Excellent. And I'm sorry? Travel. The Romans liked to move their troops up and down those roads as well. And it was also good for communication, which begins to give us a hint why Jesus chose only these 7. Because most scholars would agree that these letters that were written to these messages to these 7 churches were intended not just for them, but for who else? For everybody. For not just the ones on that lifeline of that Roman communication system, but throughout the ancient world. And so these messages were certainly intended for all of those first century churches. But guess who else they're intended for as well? Us. Because I would submit to you folks, there's not a thing, you pointed out the good, the bad, and everything in between. There's not a thing from which we can't learn. You know, 5 of those 7 churches, Jesus made the statement, and I speak verbatim here, I have this against you. You got a problem. 2 of the 7 churches, there were no problems that he mentioned. But you know, we can learn from the good. We can learn from the negative. We can benefit. But before we do that, we've got to understand how to study the book of Revelation. Not just chapters 2 and 3, but the entirety, the other 20 chapters as well. So let's talk a little bit about what we might call the style or the genre of this writing called Revelation. There are some Bibles, I don't know, they're old, much older, but in the place of Revelation, it says the apocalypse. What's an apocalypse? I'm sorry?
Disaster at the end of time.
Well, that's what we oftentimes think of. Any other ideas? The apocalypse. Or this style of writing, Revelation is written in a style of writing, a genre of writing called apocalyptic. And there are several words that we can, synonyms for apocalyptic we can use, that can kind of give us a little bit of a foothold into the book of Revelation. What are some other synonyms for apocalyptic? And the title of Revelation ought to give you a pretty good clue right here. I'm sorry? The end? Could be. It could be. But you're on the right track, no doubt. Very good. I'm sorry? Okay, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Very good. If something is a revelation, what does that say to you? It's something new. It is a revealing. It's an uncovering. It's an unveiling. And John, the writer, by the way, which John is this? There are all kinds of Johns in the New Testament. Which John is this, we think? The Apostle John. Very good. You know, for about 250 years, the early church writers had no doubt that's who it was. After about 250 years on up in the first century, they began to say, well, this could be another John, because the Greek that he uses here is just not as smooth. It's just not as precise as what we see in the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Can you think of any reasons why that might be the case? Oh, man. Every one of us over 60 years old, we understand that, right? Those of us bumping 70 years old, we really understand that. Anything academically in your life changed in the last few decades? John's older, much older. This is probably, and we'll talk more about the date of Revelation in just a moment, this is probably 50, 60 years after Christ has left the earth. John's an old man. Also, he's probably using scribes, in addition to the fact that he may not just be as academically fluent as he once was. But there seems to be no doubt. It's obvious that the listeners here in these 7 churches know who John is. Why? What? That's very true. And does he just tell them anything besides, I'm John? So it's obvious they know who he is. You know, 10 years from now, Lord willing, if I'm still here, I'm not going to have to introduce myself to y'all in a Bible class. You'll know who he is. You probably dread it. I understand that. But the bottom line is, John was well known to these folks. And John, as he brings this message to them, he tells us a little bit later on, he is in exile. Where is he? Patmos. Where is Patmos? It's an island, yeah. It's just a little bit past Newark over here. It's an island down in the Mediterranean Sea, kind of at the confluence of the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. It was a desert island, we'd call it, and the Romans used it for that very purpose. Now, it's kind of unusual They didn't execute John. Because John was deemed, like a lot of Christians, a subversive, a revolutionary, a rebel. And the Romans had a real problem with insurrectionists. That was the greatest paranoia that the Roman world faced. And typically, if there was someone that was deemed to be a revolutionary, an insurrectionist, what did they typically do with them? They executed them. And they made examples, good point. And they had a very unique way of doing that, a horrible way. It was called what? Crucifixion. That's why they put Jesus to death in the fashion they did. And as I said a moment ago, it's fascinating that this John, that undoubtedly, and even some Roman historians like Tacitus said he was an insurrectionist. You think, why didn't they put him to death? I think I know the answer. How about you? Can you think of a reason why John was exiled to Patmos instead of hung on a cross?
To serve the purpose of God.
Very good. 100% right. Carlin said, if you didn't hear, God had a job for John to bring this revealing, this unveiling, this uncovering, this revelation, not just to these 7 churches, not just to the churches in the first century, but to you and me too. Isn't it great how God works? We just don't focus on that, I don't think, near enough. But John writes in this very special form called apocalyptic writing. And it's correctly pointed out, there are several things about apocalyptic that you need to understand that we kind of have a hard time in our society today. Apocalyptic writing was a form or a style or a genre of writing that was very, very popular in the ancient world. For about 400 to 500 years, it was very, very popular. How many of you have ever heard through the years that Revelation was a secret code for Christians? Anybody ever heard that before besides me? Oh, yeah. Folks, I hate to be disillusioning. That's not quite the truth. And the reason is that this writing was so popular that the style of writing was so popular that many, many people, many cultures wrote in this form. Revelation is not the only apocalyptic work. It's not the only apocalyptic work in the Bible. Can you tell me the 2 most prominent other books that are apocalyptic in nature? Daniel? One more. Starts with an E. Ezekiel. Daniel and Ezekiel. If you go, in fact, if we had the time, I just spent well over a year at Highway 36 on Sunday evening and Wednesday evening. We studied Revelation. Fascinating. I loved it because we didn't have to hurry. We got through, and time after time after time, we'd go back to the Old Testament and we would find these apocalyptic messages in Ezekiel and Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Lots of times some of the same symbolism that's used in Revelation was used there hundreds and hundreds of years before. It's called the rebirth of imagery, the scholars say. And you had this, and if you don't understand that symbolism and you don't understand what it was saying to those folks, we're not going to understand the application to us today. Because it is highly, highly, highly symbolic. And you've got to understand that they understood that symbolism. They understood it. And we, again, do the same thing today. We just talked about the number 13 when we were talking about numerology. But let me give you another example. How many of us would really like right now, here early August, to see some rain. Hey, this old boy grew up in the cotton patch with a hoe in his hand or a 30-foot joint of irrigation pipe on his shoulder, praying every day in the summer, please, Lord, let it rain. I am enthralled by rain. Trouble is, moved to Fort Worth, you know what? It's rained more in Abilene than it has here this summer. I'm not even going to go there to try to decide what that means. But the bottom line, let's just assume that I'm sitting here and all of a sudden it starts raining. I can see through those big old glass windows out there and I see the rain pouring down. It's not happening, by the way, okay? Don't turn around. But if it were, hypothetically, and I made a statement, I said, folks, it's raining cats and dogs. Now, a whole bunch of you probably turn around to look to see the rain, but would any of you expect to see furry creatures falling out of the sky? Why? I just said it's raining cats and dogs. Why would you not expect to see canines and felines falling out of the sky? Because we use that symbolism. Most of us, our whole lives, have heard that. We know. Anybody in here never heard that expression before? Raining cats and dogs? No. We all did. We all understand what that means. You know, Carl and I was thinking too, if you and I were discussing a football game, being two ex-coaches, and I said, you know, that offense was destroyed by the blitz. What does that mean? They can't block. And the defense is rushing more than just the down linemen. You got linebackers coming, you got maybe safeties coming, maybe cornerbacks coming. You got all these people coming in. Carter and I understand that because that's part of the vernacular that we grew up playing and coaching and watching. We understand what the blitz was. But you know, if someone is listening to our conversation who's from Germany and has no idea about American football, and he hears me saying the offense was destroyed by the blitz, what's he think happened? He's thinking that a lightning bolt wiped out that whole side of the field. Because in German, blitz is lightning. Carter said in World War II, the Germans had what they called the Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. But we understand blitz if you're an American football fan. We've got to understand these concepts the best we can when we get into Revelation. You know, one of my favorite stories in a little bit of time, since this is all we're going to look at today, in Revelation, the 9th chapter, there is this highly symbolic apocalyptic writing. And it's talking about God's bringing judgment upon the world, particularly the Roman Empire. And you see these locusts, this invasion of locusts coming in. But it's not locusts like we think about. These locusts are armored. And they have firepower in their mouths and in their tails. And they have wings that, according to Revelation 9, sound like the thundering of hooves of animals. Say, what's that mean? What's that mean? Now, we're not going to get into that, but just to give you real quickly. You go back in the Old Testament, Joel talks about a somewhat similar scene where God sends locusts upon mankind as punishment and judgment. And so particularly these Jewish Christians are here, they understand the symbolism. These locusts are God's judgment on mankind. But these locusts have a demonic sense about them. And they understand that Satan's behind all this. But then there's a history lesson that kicks in here as well. And by the way, anytime you hear me preach or teach, Adrian, they're always going to be a history lesson. I've got 2 degrees in history, and I'm going to talk about history because I think it's invaluable. and it's essential to understand anything in the past. At this particular time in the Roman Empire, they were plagued. They had a lot of external invasion, particularly nomadic, barbaric people that invaded various and sundry parts of the Roman Empire. And there was one group of folks way back to the east, out of Mesopotamia, way back to the east, between Tigris and Euphrates River, called the Parthians. These, by the way, these folks were barbaric, semi-nomadic, horrible, heinous people that inflicted all kinds of harm and all kinds of things. They were the ancestors of the Iranians. If it kind of gives you an idea, that nut hadn't fallen too far from the tree. And they were constantly invading the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And when they would come in this eastern part of the Roman Empire, they spread murder and mayhem and pillage every time they came in. There's even one of the 7 churches we're going to look at, Lord willing, in the next few weeks, that was built to be a barrier against these Parthians. And the thing is, they were one of the very few totally mounted armies in the whole world. The cavalry, we think of that today. They rode horses. And they were great horsemen, and they had an ability that shocked a lot of folks. They were archers. Their main source of offensive power were bows and arrows. And they shot these bows and arrows when they attacked on these frontal charges. And then when they went by, they could turn on their horses and they could shoot going too. Coming and going. They were terrified. The Roman Empire was terrified, even though it wasn't a big nation, an empire. They were a constant vex to the Roman Empire. And when he's talking about, the locusts, a lot of these Jewish Christians can think back to Joel, the book of Joel, and they could think about this plague and this pain and this anguish that was coming in the front and from behind. Undoubtedly, the Parthians came to mind. You know, there have been some very, very, very unique interpretations of Revelation 9. There's one scholar, scholar, who said back during the Cold War that these armored locusts with the firepower in the mouth and the tail, get this, were Russian helicopters. Russian helicopters. I vividly remember Dr. Fair in class. He says, now if you have to know, Dr. Fair was a South African with a very pronounced South African brogue. And he said, I guess you could say these were apocalyptic helicopters. I love that. I love to say apocalyptic helicopters. But that's where some people get so far out, they didn't understand what it would say. What would Roman or Russian helicopters, what kind of impact would that make on first century Christians? Done. But the bottom line is, the eternal message for us, even though the Parthians don't play much a role in our lives today, and a lot of us didn't know anything about the book of Joel, tragically, but the bottom line is, it's obvious Satan's behind this Roman Empire and all these plagues that are coming upon, and God's going to take care of it. God's going to take care of it. And the Christians are going to win. That's the beauty of the book of Revelation, but they just didn't. A lot of people just don't understand that when you go through. Now, I've done a lot of the talking. Any questions or comments to this point? Before we go a little bit farther and hopefully laying some groundwork for our brief study of Revelation 2 and 3. Any comments? Anybody still awake? Anybody not totally confused at this point? Okay, let's talk about it, because like I say, this message is for this first century. It's an eternal message for us. But a lot of people make the mistake of trying to use their own interpretation instead of the message that God is bringing. Let's talk just a little bit about the dating of Revelation, because that too is very, very important. The early church writers, I'm talking about the 2nd and 3rd century writers, all basically agreed that this was in the first century, the end of the first century. And they all basically agreed in those early church writings that this was during the rule of the Roman Emperor Domitian. Anybody know anything about Domitian? He was mean. That's a good way to put it. You know, Domitian started out a pretty good emperor. He made a lot of internal improvements. He built a lot of those roads that we talked about a moment ago, made a lot of strategic and logistic things, help in the empire, and was pretty good. But as the years went by, Domitian continued to decline. We don't know if it was a mental decline or just a spiritual decline, but Domitian, good way to put it, was mean. He was vicious. In fact, he would be known right in the same ranks as a former emperor named Nero. Y'all remember Nero? Nero, back in AD 65, decided he's going to do some urban renewal in Rome. So he set fire to the ghetto called Donkey Flats, where most of the Christians lived. Most of them were living in poverty. He set it on fire. The problem is the wind shifted, and it burned down about 75% of Rome itself. Well, Nero couldn't admit he did that. So guess who he blamed? The Christians, because that's where the fire broke out. Well, most of the persecution under Nero of the Christians evolved right there around the city of Rome. But Domitian spread the persecution empire-wide. And all the things that Nero did and all the horrible barbaric acts that he did in the city of Rome, Domitian spread them all around the world. Now, Domitian had an arrogant attitude about himself. In fact, to kind of give you we're going to see this, kind of jumping ahead to one of the 7 churches. It talks about the fact that Jesus says he holds the 7 stars in his right hand. Now, again, that was reference to Nero, because Nero minted a coin that the archaeologists have found. We have evidences of it today still. His infant son holding 7 stars in his hand. Now, Domitian, what was he trying to say? This symbolism? His son holding 7 stars in his hand? 7, we've already talked about, represents what? Completeness. What was Domitian saying? That all these Christians would know. They'd seen those coins. I'm sorry? No doubt. He said, I and my dynasty, we control the universe. But in that church that we're talking about, Jesus says, no, I hold the 7 stars in my hand. I'm in control. You think that might be necessary for those first century Christians who are being slaughtered and starved to death and persecuted? Why would that be necessary for them to understand? Jesus says, I'm in control. Have you ever looked around our world and seen what's going on? And maybe for a moment of doubt thought, who's in control? That's what these Christians were going through. And like I say, these early scholars say that there's no doubt in their minds, and there's no doubt in my mind, there was no doubt in Dr. Ian Fair's mind, that this was probably written about AD 95, right at the end of Domitian's reign, which, like I just said, the further his reign went on, the worse he got, or the meaner he got. And so, about AD 95, we know from a lot of internal evidence that we gather from Revelation and a lot of external evidence as well. There's a Roman historian named Tacitus who spends a lot of time talking about Christians in the Roman Empire. And he says this was Domitian. And I think it's important for us to understand that, pardon me, because we can gather a whole lot about what the author is saying. Okay, any questions? Any questions? This class, 15, okay? 15 after 11? Yeah. Okay. Nobody else would, though. Any questions or comments? You know, I thought one Christmas at Highway 36, they buy this clock for my Christmas present, which is about the size of that podium up there. Biggest clock I had ever seen. I thought they were just being nice. I got to thinking, they're not being nice. But as we go through, we're going to see these 7 churches. Pardon me, my voice just about shot anyway, so. These 7 churches, every one of these messages, like I say, is going to be applicable to us. Maybe not every single message of every single church, but folks, we can learn from them. But again, the key is to go back and to understand the Old Testament ties, the historic ties, the culture, the context, and to say, okay, what's that saying to me? How does that apply to the Saginaw Church of Christ in the year 2025, even though this was, like I say, probably about 1895. Some scholars, by the way, just very quickly because we're just about out of time, some scholars say that perhaps John had been granted leave of exile, and he's back, and he's not on Patmos for the entirety of this ride. We don't know, it doesn't matter. But he tells us, of course, at the beginning, he is on Patmos. Any other comments or questions? Well, like I say, my voice is just about shot, so I'm going to stop right there. As I mentioned, I had in fact, one more thing before we do it. There's always one more. Adrian, there's always one more thing, right? Always one more thing. Why would we study this book that, like I say, is kind of intimidating? Why would we study something that happened 2,000 years ago that we just don't really understand all of it? Why? Good point. You know, 2 Timothy 3:16, for all Scripture is inspired by whom? By God. And it's profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good. Everything here is good for you. But I want to read one verse in closing this morning that will help us understand the value and the necessity of understanding as much as we can about the book of Revelation. Revelation, the first chapter, verse 3. This is John speaking here. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. Blessed. You read it, you hear it, you apply it, you're going to be blessed. Now, in the New Testament, when you see that word blessed, you know, you think back to what we call Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, where we had the Beatitudes, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. What does the word blessed mean? Give me a good, thorough definition of blessed. Happy. We think first off happy, and it even goes deeper than that. What can we add to that? Real good start on that right there. Real good start. Very good. You're honored by God. One scholar that I read one time said it has the indication of drawing closer to God. And the closer you get to God, what happens? Joy, happiness, confidence. In fact, one definition I read about blessed in the New Testament is euphoria. What's euphoria? You know, you think about in the book of Revelation where John talks about he was in the Lord on the Lord's day on the Isle of Patmos. You think, here's this old man, probably disabled to some degree, crippled, isolated on this desert island. And he says, I was in the Lord on the day of the Lord. What was he saying? I was in the Spirit. He was experiencing a euphoria that went beyond physical circumstances. And I think as we look at that, we understand that. And he says, you internalize what's in the book of Revelation, you're going to be blessed. I don't know about you, but I think that's a pretty good reason to study the book of Revelation. All Scripture, no exceptions, including the book of Revelation. Well, it's 10:14, Adrian. I finished 1 minute early, which means that if I ever speak again, I get an extra minute. Well, I am too, so it all works out. Thank y'all very much. I enjoyed it.